So the first background work we're going to do here is going to be using our cell pattern and our 4-color gradient filters to create an animated background for a children's TV show. If you look at the project we have open, it's project 1 here, cell color mirror. In the timeline, we have just one solid that's preset that we can start to apply our effects to. So I'm just going to highlight that. And if I bring up my effects palette, I'm just going to hit Command 5 or Control 5 on the PC to bring up my effects palette here. And what I want to do is locate the effect called cell pattern. So very quickly, just click in here and type in the word cell. It will go down and locate it, which is under here, basically in the render section. So I'm just going to double click that to apply it to my layer. Let's hit Command 5, just pull that window out of the way. And if we look at the effect controls window here, we can see we have a lot of presets that we can apply. The first one here is the type of pattern that we're actually using, and by default it is set to a bubbles background. Clicking here will show me all of the different ones that I have. So just for a second, I'll keep on the bubbles one. The first option we have here really is contrast, and that's how strong the areas of color are separated here in the background. So if I increase the contrast slider, you'll see that the shapes actually distort and form more towards what the title says, in this case bubbles. So we're increasing the contrast to remove the grays and kind of fine tune it down to a circular shape. And if you want to come back again, we can obviously blend them together. Now all of these items can obviously be animated because we have a stopwatch next to each property, so you can produce some wonderful things this way. Further down here you have the disperse amount. Now what this one does, if we drag all the way back down to the left, which is down to 0, you'll see the pattern in the background is slowly forming back into a very straight grid. So you can actually go from one point to the other. The maximum here is 1.5 if we drag all the way to the right hand side there. So that's maximum dispersion. The shapes are very random on the screen. And then we can also affect the size of this. And as we drag the size, I'm increasing it up here, you can see that this effect is rendering itself on every single new frame. So no matter how large we go here, we get wonderfully smooth graphics, depending on whichever one you want to choose from here. So let's bring that back down again, just a little bit more. Let's come down to about here. Now, as well as bubbles, let's have a look at some of the others. We have crystals, which allows us to lay these really nice, almost bevel-edged graphics in the background. And again, the contrast will affect exactly what's going on with those. You see, as we pull down here, they're looking more 3D. And again, if we go to size, we can increase that and see it in much more detail. The dispersion, once animated on that, will look really nice. You've got this really nice 3D grid, almost changing shape at this point there. And there's various other ones down here you can try. We're going to use pillow in just a second. But another one I do like is tubular down here. Let's come down and choose that. And what I'll do is I'll just take the size down and zoom out just a little bit more. And you can see this kind of produces almost a bacterial type graphic where you have little cells moving around in the background. And again, dispersion will come all the way down and actually form a grid from these. You can see them coming together and they form a circle. As we come out to the right hand side, they start to join and then kind of blend this way. So it's really, really cool effects. Contrast will obviously thicken those out or thin them down into more standard shapes. Now we also have an overflow option here which controls how the colors that fade off the edge of each of these cell items is blending with each other. So clip is very much a standard option. One other one I have under here which I do want to show you is wrap back, and what it does is kind of replicates the color gradients as they pass from one object to the other. So it's kind of repeating itself, and that becomes more apparent with contrast as we drag, and you can see these backgrounds becoming more and more repetitive in between each of the cells that we've created. So once you start animating this and adding color to it, you do get some really wonderful effects. Now what I'm going to do is set this up for animation because we have an evolution option down the bottom here, which when I rotate, you'll see the cells actually turn around inside themselves and allows us to create motion in here. So I'm going to come back and reset everything that I want it to be for my title sequence. So back up to cell pattern, I'm going to be using the pillow option here. So that brings up just a series of very straight lines that kind of blend into each other. And if I just increase the size here, let's go up to where I'm going to be. I'm going to go for about 250%, something like that, because I'm going to use these areas in the cells here for placing title graphics for our TV program. So we can use these areas to show different pieces of content. I'm going to set the overflow back to clip, so it's just black with a slightly feathered edge. And the contrast is pretty good around here. I'll just drop that to about 300. Now another thing we can do at any time is hit invert, and we can keyframe this also, so we can have it change from black to white and back again, and we're going to apply that in just a second. So what we want to do now is add some keyframes to this to make it all move. Now we're only going to animate two properties of this effect. It's actually going to be the disperse amount and also the evolution down here. Now the first part of the animation is going to happen at 1 second because I don't want any motion of this effect between 0 and 1 second on my timeline. So I'm just going to scrub along there to 1 second across and then come back up to the effect controls here and apply a keyframe for disperse. But what I'm going to do is pull that all the way back down to 0 because I want to start with an actual squared off grid. Okay, so that's where we're going to begin. And evolution, let's turn on a keyframe for that also so we can see that that's set to 0. And now if I hit the U key, I can see my keyframed elements down here in the timeline. So there's my disperse and evolution. And what we can do now is start to work our way along the timeline and start adding in our keyframes. And if I come across here to 2 seconds, we can now start to adjust our keyframe values. So let's come back up to the effects palette here and now choose to disperse this all to the maximum value of 1.5. There we go. So we've got all our dispersion values. And then let's adjust the evolution here also. So I'm just going to drag this around 1 complete turn to 1 revolution here. So if I just hit the 0 key and do a quick RAM preview of that, you can see that for the first second, the item stays completely still and then converts over the gap between 1 and 2 seconds. And there we can see it taking place. Now we want this to stay static for another second because once it's reached this point at 2 seconds, there's going to be 1 second here where some title graphics appear in certain spots of these cell patterns. So I'm going to go all the way across to 3 seconds. And I want to add another evolution keyframe here to the same value that we currently have. So nice shortcut for that, very easy, is to hold down the Option key or the Alt key and click on the name evolution right here. And that will add another keyframe at 1 revolution. That will hold it now between 2 and 3. Let's scroll out to 4 seconds, come back to evolution and maybe animate this now moving in the opposite direction. So maybe 129, 130 degrees back to there. Again, I can scroll out to 5 seconds, and in my effects palette, once again, Option or Alt click on evolution to add another keyframe for the same current value. And then let's scroll across to 6 seconds, and all we need to do is apply a different evolution value. So let's just scroll around to there again. So if I hit 0 now, let's do a full RAM preview of this. We can see it changing shape only between those different 1 second parameters that we have. So we've already got our change between 1 and 2. It's now rendering 3 and 4. And then it will pause there, go through to 5 and carry on to 6. So let's just preview that. So there's our shape change, carries on from there, and it's giving us these great areas where we can then drop content in afterwards. Now obviously I want to smooth the motion down on this. Everything's very linear. The process starts and finishes in a very abrupt fashion. So what I want to do is add some easing to these keyframes. So if I come back down to the timeline, what I'm going to do is select the very first keyframes here, which is where the motion starts to move out, and this is where it stops. Again, it stops to this point, so I'm going to select this one also. I'm just holding down the Shift key to add these together, and this one. So each one of these keyframes is where the motion starts and goes out. And what I'll do is hold down the Control key and click on that, or right-click on the PC to bring up my extra menu here, and come up to the Keyframe Assistant, and I'm going to say Ease the Motion Out. So what it'll do is it will start more slowly and build up speed. And then likewise, let's select all the other keyframes. So we highlight these two, this one, and the one at keyframe 6. And once again, Control or right-click on there, bring up the Keyframe Assistant, and let's say Ease the Motion In. And another round preview of this now will show that motion much more controlled. You see it's very more fluid, and it does match the background cell pattern, which is also quite organic in the way it's done. So I'll just preview those first couple of changes up to about 4 seconds. So you see it starts out slow and just blends itself in. It's not quite so crazy and jagged. Now, one thing I do want to do is to apply the invert change I pointed out. I want it to actually start out in this function here, so it's white cells with a black border, and then I want it to kind of flash between the two and then change into the opposite, so it's black cells on a white background, because we're going to turn this into more of a colored electrical kind of field using the 4-color gradient pattern afterwards. So I'm going to come back to 1 second, which is just at the point where we start to convert everything from one shape to another. And in my Effect Controls window right here, we have our Invert button. I'm going to turn on a keyframe for that, so it stores this particular color variant at this point. Then I'm just going to hit the Page Down key on my keyboard just to move me 1 frame along in the timeline and turn on Invert, and that will convert me across to black. And what I'm going to do very quickly is just hit Page Down again to take me another frame, and I'm going to turn Invert off. So what I'm doing is just progressing 1 frame at a time and setting a very quick flash doing it this way. I could also just copy and paste the keyframes that I'm creating, but this is just an easy way to do it as well. So I'm just going to hit Page Down, Invert, Page Down, and again, just 1 frame at a time for, 5 or 6 frames. It doesn't really matter how much you want to do. get it to where you want it to be, and make sure you end up with the cells on black with a white border. And now a preview again will just show that there's a nice flash just as this starts to convert into our section graphics here. So there's the flash just as it converts, really quick and easy applied with a few simple keyframes. Now let's come all the way back to the start. I want to add some graphics in here now. So I'm actually going to close down the Effect Controls window for a second and come across to my project window, and we're going to drag in a couple of files to make the first part of our titling effect. So just come down to the timeline here and just collapse solid 1 so we don't need to see the keyframes in there anymore. And we know that everything is set to 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 seconds, so we know where the breaks are going to be. In my Illustrator folder here, or Illustrator Files folder in the project window, let's open that up, and the first thing I'll do is bring down the T3V logo. Illustrator file, just drag it to the top of my timeline here. There it appears on screen. Let's turn on anti-aliasing just to smooth that out. And I'll just move that into this top grid here and maybe just scale it down a touch. So it's kind of centered in there. And then what I'll do is come back across to my project window and bring in this one called Title Coming. It's called the Coming Up text, which I'm also going to place into one of these grids. Now I do want it bigger, and obviously because I'm scaling up an Illustrator file here, I'm going to come back to the timeline and turn on continuous rasterization. Let's keep that quality nice and sharp. And let's place that over here in this right-hand grid, just about there. So we've got our first section ready, so it's saying what's coming up, and then the graphics will convert and show us the programs that are coming next. Now obviously these are coming in as a default length of the whole composition. That's how it's set up in our preferences. So I'm going to come across to 1 second, which is where we need to stop these graphics. I'll select both of them and then just apply a very quick trim, which is holding down the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and hitting the right square bracket, and that will trim those out to the length of exactly where I want to be. So if I go 1 frame on from here now, just by hitting page down, you'll see we get our conversion of color, and also those graphics have gone. So they will only show up for that period of time. What we'll do is just scroll across to 2 seconds now, which is where our grid then comes into a static position ready for us to add our other graphics. And let's come back up here to our Illustrator files, and I'm going to bring in Title 1. And this is the first title program that will be visible, so just drag that down into the timeline. And obviously that only appears here at 2 seconds onwards because our time cursor was in that location. And again, I'm going to turn on the anti-aliasing quality and the continuous rasterization because I wish to scale these up to fit into different cells. And that's the cool thing about this. It's so random, we can just position these wherever we need to and whatever size because the cell pattern is defining that. That's just fine. And then the final thing I want to do is bring in one of our small QuickTime movies. So back to the project window, come to the movie section here, and I have this small one called Smile. Okay, so drag this one down again, still at 2 seconds here. And let's just pull this little face across into this blank section over here. Now likewise, I want to trim both of these layers out so they don't play beyond 3 seconds because they're only going to be visible for a single second. So I'll move my time cursor across to 3 seconds here on the timeline. Once again, select both of these layers, hold down the Option or the Alt key, right square bracket, and trim those two out. I can always turn anti-aliasing on here for the QuickTime movie. So what I'll do is do a very quick round preview at this point. And we can see the flash happening there that we set as keyframes. Now we come out, and as soon as we reach the final resting point there, these graphics now appear in those cells and then disappear just before we go to the next section. So there's our titles, there's our flash, and here's our graphics appearing. So we'll finish this off just by adding another graphic and another title further down the timeline. So what I'll do is move my time cursor along to 4 seconds. Again, that's where the grid settles back down to static. And then if we come back to the project window, I'm going to use this movie that's called Run. And then inside my Illustrator folder here, let's just view them all at the same time. We see we have Run. I'm also going to select with the Apple key or the Control key on the PC, select the Title 2 also. That allows me to drag them both down at the same time. And let's throw them down here to the top of my timeline, and they will come in together at the very, very top. Obviously, I want to make sure the anti-aliasing is on for both of them and continuous rasterization for the type. And then if we come across, we can trim them out. So let's take the time cursor across to 5 seconds. Again, hold down Option or Alt and right square bracket. Let's trim those two out there. And then if I just Apple click or Control click on one of them, that will deselect it so I can highlight just the top one here, which is Run Movie. And let's place him down here into this cell. And then come up and select the text. It's got continuous rasterization applied, so we can scale that up or down. Let's place that into its central point here. Again, scale it. Don't forget you're holding down the Shift key when you scale this, otherwise you will scale out of proportion. Drag that in there, and those graphics are now set. So I'm just going to do a full round preview of this now. So we've rendered all the way up to that point, so it's giving us a very fast round preview. The graphics will now change, settle into position, and the final movie is there before we change. So let's just preview that. There's the graphics, there's the flash, there's the motion, and there's the new selection. Now, like I said, the reason we turn this into an invert is I want to make this cell pattern when it's on a black background very electric and very colorful. And for this, I'm going to use another nice background effect, which is called 4-color gradient. So let's come all the way back across to 0 seconds in the timeline. And then I'm going to come down and select solid 1. This is the base layer that has our cell pattern applied to it. And then again, if I hit Command 5 or Control 5 to bring up my effects palette here, I'm going to type in probably just the letter 4, and that will access the 4-color gradient effect for me. Simply double click that, it will add it to this layer. Let's just move that out of the way, or Command 5 again just to remove it. And you'll see what it's done is it's added itself on top of the cell pattern that we've just created. So the cell pattern effectively is hidden at this point in time. So let me just close that up here in the Effect Controls window. And it's a very straightforward filter. It's going to allow us to animate or control up to 4 separate color variants, and you can see them all here in the background. If I select 4-color gradient here as a title, you see the points appear exactly where the colors are. So if I pick up the blue here and drag it round, you can see the way that the colors interact. They blend across each other, which just is such a wonderful way to change the color in the background of any animation. And obviously, if you use layer blending modes and effects like that, you can make these blend really nicely with whatever objects are behind it. That's obviously what we're going to do. Let me just undo that. What I'll do is come back to the Effect Controls window here and just change the color. I'm quite happy with the yellow, the green, and the blue. That's going to be quite bright and vivid. I want to change this color here, the sort of magenta. I'm going to change that to a red. So let me just click on that. Let's come up and choose fairly bright red over here. And you'll see when I do that, this color updates. Another thing just to point out in this palette as one of those options here is the blend value. And that will allow us to sort of increase or decrease the amount of contrast there is around each of the colors. So not too visible if you go to the left, but if I come to the right and start dragging, you'll see that the colors are actually fading more and more into each other and not being so separately defined. So it allows you to produce somewhat more of a smooth gradient, which is made up of 4 colors. So these are things you might just want to play with at some point, but I just wanted to point those out as we go through this. So I can leave that down about 100. I'm happy with that. What I do want to do, though, is to animate these 4 points moving around the screen, because I don't want the colors to stay consistently top left, bottom left. I want them to move around the screen, and that will then be noticeable when we have our cell pattern underneath. So obviously we'll add a keyframe here. We're at 0 seconds in the timeline. You can see that there. And then I'm going to come up and just add a keyframe for point 1, point 2, point 3, and point 4, and then we can simply go ahead and animate them. So that's been set down at 0. I'm going to scroll across to 1 second, okay, and then just come into the window here and start dragging the points around. So if I pick up the bottom right one here, I can just move that to the top. You can see the color shifting through the center there. Let's take the green. All the keyframes are applied here, so it doesn't matter how many times we change it. After Effects will interpolate all of these options for us. So let's pull that one down here, maybe behind the wording there. Scroll across to 2 seconds and make another few changes. So I'll grab the blue this time, pull it into the middle. Just take the green up there. Let's pull the red down, take the yellow to the top there. And obviously it doesn't have to be even. You can make them blend as much as you want to. So I'm just quickly going to go through a second at a time on the timeline. Pull the yellow down here, put the blue back in the top, green down here, maybe the red in the center. So we're kind of getting more of a blend over this point, and quickly make another few changes. So it's all random, and obviously we could animate these using an expression, so it would be a little bit more random, but I'm quite happy dragging these around just 1 second at a time. And now we're across at 5 seconds. Let's just change these once more into these different places and come out finally to the very end of the animation where everything's kind of fading off, and I'll just apply one more set of changes. Maybe we'll end up with them actually in central points here. So pull that one down over there and the green one on the left-hand side. So if I do a round preview of that, you'll obviously see we still have our graphics on top, and the colors are now shifting through each other. As they blend over the top of one another, you can see the colors changing also. So where the green and the yellows mix, we get different shifts of color. The blue's getting pushed out of the way here and gets darker again as it comes to the bottom because it's moving further away from colors that replace it. So, some pretty cool effects here just using 4-color gradient. Coolest thing, though, is how we're going to make this interact with the background and affect the sort of electric view of our cell pattern. What I need to do is come back across to the Effect Controls window and just change its transfer mode. Just like the layer blending modes inside the timeline, I'm going to come down and choose Color Mode. And then what that'll do is blend the colors together with what's going on behind based on the light and dark values. And you see we've got this wonderful electric shine around the blended edge of our cell pattern. So let's do one final RAM preview here. And there we can see the finished RAM preview. We've got that really nice motion background created with the cell pattern. We've then got this really cool electric edge applied around the side using 4-color gradient. And you also notice the color shifting around on those faded edges, which is just done through some very simple keyframe animation. So just applying these two filters together gives you a great way to create a title sequence. You start out with the filters as they are and you're not entirely sure which direction to take them, but once you start mixing them like this, there's just no limit to what you can actually do. Now there's one more effect I do want to show you before we continue on to the next section, and for this I'm going to, let's just close down the effect controls here, and I'm going to check that I'm all the way back at the beginning of the timeline. What I'm going to do is create a new solid, so I'll hit Command Y or Control Y, you should be familiar with that shortcut by now, and I'm going to call this one Mirror. Okay, so we're going to apply a new filter called Mirror to this. I'll make it the size of my composition and say OK. And then the cool thing about the solid layers is I actually meant to create this as an adjustment layer, but it's very easy for me to show you how to change between one or the other. Down here in the timeline, this column here represents adjustment layers, and even though I've created a solid at this point, I'm going to click right here and turn it into an adjustment layer, so now any filters I apply to this will affect all the layers below it. So again, let me hit Command 5 just to bring up the effects palette over here on the right side. I'll type in Mirror, that brings up that one. Let's double click it to apply it to our layer, and we can close that down, Command 5 or Control 5. And here we have the options, very simple options. We have a reflection angle that allows us to choose the angle at which we reflect all the graphics around, and don't forget, as it's an adjustment layer, it's happening to every layer beneath it. If you notice that it's not looking very sharp around the edge here, we haven't got anti-aliasing turned on the adjustment layer itself. So as soon as I turn that on, it will smooth out here. And then all we need to do is adjust the actual position of the reflection itself. So you see that you could mix this into your animation quite easily by just playing around with a few of these properties, and you can do some wonderful things with it. Now, it's not proper for the animation I want to do at this point, but it's again just one of those really cool background filters that you could apply keyframes and even expressions to make some very interesting animations. So I'm going to go ahead and close this one down because we're now going to move on to the next animation. And let's close this composition down and come back to the top of the project window here. Let's close all these up. The next project we're going to be working on is number 2, which is Offset. And this is a really funky lesson. Let's double click and open that. Come across to the composition, hit 0 to do a quick RAM preview. And you'll see what this is. This is a 3D rendered graphic I've created inside of Lightwave, and it's already preset for these animation properties. And I've also added a solid layer on top with a lens flare that's been keyframed to sort of attach itself to the end of the ship here and also flicker using a very simple expression. Now this has been rendered onto a transparent background, and the client would like me to place a repeating sky in the background as if this thing is moving exceptionally fast. Now there's no need for us to do that inside a 3D application because it's going to be a lot of rendering time, plus we're pretty much set to the speed at which we render it. So if the sky is moving by at maybe a mile a second and we need to go faster than that, we'd pretty much have to go in and re-render it again. Now we're going to find an easy way around this, and that's using a filter inside of After Effects called Offset. Now to do this, we're going to set a file up in Photoshop which will create our sky backdrop for us. So I'm just going to jump across into Photoshop, and then I'm going to hit Command N or Control N and create a new document. Now we're going to create one of a specific size because what I'm going to do is use my clouds effect. So I'm going to render some clouds in the background. And if I want these clouds to be seamless, i.e. the left edge perfectly matches the right hand edge when I drop this into After Effects, I need to make my file a multiple of 128 pixels on both dimensions. So I'm going to put this up to a size that's pretty much going to match our video or just above it using the 128. And the first option I have is 768 pixels square. That'll give me enough size to cover the file that we're working on inside of After Effects. If I make it smaller than that, the offset filter will still work, but I will notice more repetition. So by making it 768, I'm going to get a larger area of cloud, which you won't notice repetition on when we offset it quite so much. Obviously, my resolution is 72 pixels per inch, and I'm going to be using RGB color. So if I click OK, what I'm going to do is now generate some elements both as layers and channels to create the clouds and the sky backdrop. So the first thing I want to do is drop a gradient in the background here that is my sky color. So I'm going to go from a very dark blue to a light blue. So if I come up here and select my gradient tool from the toolbox, and I'll come up to the top here and check the color options that I'm going to have. So I could pick any one of these blends if I want to. I'm just going to go into my black-white option here, double click on this color and choose a new one for the very top section of my blend. So I'm going to go into the blue area here, And let's come down and choose a fairly dark blue, not too dark, but I don't want just a very bright sunny sky. So start with something like that. And then on this end of it, I'll just double click again on the color swatch to go back into the blues and choose something a little more sky blue around about there. Okay, so we've got a blend that's not changing too much. If you want to, let's just go back to that end and darken it down a shade more. There we go, that'll do just fine. So this is my blend color, and all I'm going to do on the background layer is just click and drag, and I will create that faded drop, okay? Now the clouds I'm going to add onto a separate layer. The reason I want to do that is I want to fade the clouds out using a layer mask so that we come down here and we still see the blue sky. I don't just want to add a whole bunch of preset clouds on here and not fade them. So to do that, I'm actually going to set it up inside a channel. So I'm coming over here to my channels palette, and you'll see that I have the red, green, and blue channels already preset. What I'm going to do is click at the bottom here and create a new empty channel. Now checking my colors are still preset to black and white, I'm going to go up to my filter menu, come down here to render and choose clouds. And that's all I'm going to do. And you see this generates a cloud pattern for me, but if we did lay this edge to edge, because we have a multiple of 128 pixels for our dimensions of the file, this edge perfectly matches this edge and will offset greatly inside of After Effects. Now we could go in here and just slightly adjust levels and things like that, but I'm pretty much going to leave that as it is, because I'm now going to use this to create a selection for our cloud. So let's come back to RGB and come back to our layers palette over here and create a new layer, same as we did for a new channel. Just click on the icon here. And if I want to, I could just double click on its name and type in cloud. So I have the name of the layer. It's easy for me to identify in future. And if I come back to the channels palette, what I want to do is make a marquee selection now of these lighter areas from this channel. So all I'll do is I'll hold down the Apple key or the Control key on the PC, and you see my cursor changes to a small selection graphic. And when I click on that, I now have a marquee selection of the lighter areas of my clouds. So let's come back to layers, just check we're on that clouds layer. And what I'm going to do is quickly flick my background and foreground colors around, so white is in the foreground, and then I'll hold down the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and hit Delete. And that will fill that selection onto this layer with white, but it's obviously containing the transparency of the alpha channel as well. So I just press Command D or Control D to deselect that. And if I come over to the layers palette here, you can see that the clouds have been created onto a transparent background. And then what I can do is come down to the layer mask button here and apply a mask to this layer, because now we can apply a gradient that comes up here and just gently fades the clouds out. So for this, I am going to be using a black and white blend, not a color blend like this, because that will get converted into levels of gray and will give me a slightly different result to what I need. So again, I'm going to come back to my presets and let's go back to black and white here. And then all I need to do is to position my cursor in the screen and drag wherever I need to be. Now my foreground color is white and my background color is black. So if I just click and drag from about here down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that I'm actually going the opposite way. So always double check how your gradient's been set up. You see here in my layers palette that the layer mask icon has changed to show us the black area at the top, which is being masked out, and the white area at the bottom, which is visible. So if I just hit Command Z and undo that, we'll drag the opposite way. So down here is going to be hidden. If I drag up to round about there, 2/3 of the way up the screen maybe, we now get a nice easy fade of these clouds into our blue backdrop, okay? So that sky is pretty much done. You can customize the way that the clouds are set up and everything just by going into the channels and maybe trying rendering clouds again if you're not happy with the random pattern it gave you. But the process is still the same. As long as you have that 128 pixels square or a multiple of that, then we'll have a nice seamless effect. So I'm just going to go to File and save this. And I'm going to name it, quite simply, Clouds PSD. Now I have saved one in here for you already. It's called Seamless Clouds PSD, just in case, so we could use that one if necessary, but we'll save this one that we've just created and drop that in there. Now what I can do is flick back across into After Effects, and if I just come over to my project window and let's double click to bring up the import dialog box, we'll see here that I can have my clouds file selected and go ahead and simply say import. Now when I do, it's obviously going to ask me what type of import I want to have because it has two layers. And I can either merge them or separate them out. Obviously, I'm going to choose merged. I just want to keep everything together. Let's say OK. And this is an error you might come up with as well. Now, we have gone over alpha channels in the previous lessons here, but this is very important. I constructed this file using an alpha channel. Remember, we created the clouds in there. And when I'm bringing it in, it's actually going to utilize that. And visually, it won't give me the effect I'm looking for because the cloud areas will now become transparent and we will actually see through it. So instead of bringing in the alpha channel, what I'm going to say at this point is ignore it, okay? Because I don't want to use the alpha channel. It doesn't mean that I have to go all the way back into Photoshop and remove it. This is giving me that one option. So just bear that in mind when you import a file that does have the alpha channel, even if you used it for construction purposes. So let's say OK. That's now appeared here in my project window. So what I'll do is I'll drag it down to the timeline. And I'm obviously checking that we're at 0 seconds in the timeline. Let's come down and drop it below the fighter movie here. So that's come in now. They see the sky has been created and it's just covering the dimensions of our file here, and that's just fine. So I don't see any initial repetition. And all we need to do now is add our offset filter to this. So again, let's hit Command 5 or Control 5 to bring up the effects palette right here. And I'm going to type in off, and that will bring up offset. So let's double click that, apply it to this layer, close the effects palette down. And you'll see here, this just simply has pretty much one main option. We do have blend with original. This is actually pretty cool. It allows us to blend the moving version over the top of the static version. So if you wanted an effect almost of a static version of clouds in the background with a gently moving one over the top, you wouldn't need two layers to do it. We could actually say blend with original, and we could see through one moving layer to another one. Let me show you what I mean. If I come to the shift center option here, this is what we'll use to animate it. You see I drag off to the side. Okay, we can see everything coming across and we're not seeing any edges there. We've got a really nice seamless backdrop. Okay, so let's pull that across. But if I now say blend with original, you can actually see the other clouds coming through in the background. Okay, so let's go for about 50%. I'm not going to use this, I just want to show it to you. And you see as I drag now, you can see a separate layer of clouds behind it. So you can get some interesting effects. Pretty handy if this is going to be moving fairly slowly. You could animate about this speed and just see the cloud layers moving one on top of the other. If we're animating this really fast, it might look a bit odd that there's a static layer in the background, but again, it was just to point that one out to you. So I'm going to bring that back down to 0 so we only see the moving clouds. And again, checking that we're at 0 seconds, what we'll do is apply a keyframe here because we're going to animate this value. So let's say Shift Center. And I'm going to go for a fairly extreme value. I'm actually going to select the first option here and say I'm going to start about 3,000 pixels off to the right-hand side of the screen. Okay, that's where we're going to begin. And then if I come down to the timeline and drag all the way to 8 seconds along, let's come back to the effect controls and go exactly in the opposite direction. So if I just click at the front of the 3000, I'm going to put in a minus. So that will now travel to the left. It's going to move a total of 6,000 pixels. And let's hit 0 and do a preview. And you see we now have this seamless sky moving in the background behind the composited layers that we already have. And once we get a few frames of this, let's go around about there, 4 or 5 seconds. You can see exactly what we have. We have this wonderful background just dragging its way through. And if we want to adjust this, if we now present this to the client, they say, well, it doesn't look like it's moving fast enough. All we have to do is go and edit those properties. So if I pull the time cursor all the way back to the beginning of the animation, we have 3,000. Let's go a little bit more. Let's do 4,500. And then I'll go all the way back to the end again, 8 seconds along to the very end of the animation. And let's put the minus to minus 4,500. Okay. Another thing to point out is obviously the anti-aliasing. Don't forget that if you're rendering any effects like this, you want to see them at full quality. So let's come down to the timeline here and turn on anti-aliasing, or hit Command U or Control U to do it automatically. And again, 0 key to do a RAM preview. Now, this is going to animate a lot faster, which is just great. Let's just go through about 3 seconds there. Okay, so now it's looking a lot more like it's moving at a real speed. It's kind of wasn't matching it before. Now, there's one final effect I want to add to this. I want to add a camera shake. I want to make it look as though maybe we're in a ship that's flying in a parallel direction to this, and I want to see sort of motion and motion blur going on. Quick and easy way to do that is for us to throw this composition into another one and apply a very simple expression. So I'm going to leave that as it is. I'm going to close this composition down, and then over here in my project window, I'm going to select this one, O2 offset, and I'm simply going to drag it down onto the composition icon right here. And that will drop it into a brand new composition of the same size and same length. Everything else is set the same way. Obviously, I will turn on anti-aliasing for this composition. What I am going to do, I'm just going to hit the S key to access its scale properties and just increase the scale about 10%, not much more. The reason I'm doing that, if I use an expression here to control kind of a random movement of this whole composition, chances are that as it moves, it can move beyond the boundaries of the screen here and we'll see a black edge around it. So I'm just cheating that by increasing the size of the composition slightly. You could also reduce the size of the composition that we're currently working in just to give it that bit of extra room. So the animation of the layer itself is very easy to do. What we're going to do is select it in a timeline and hit the P key to show us the position values. And instead of animating these keyframes, I'm just going to hold down the Option key or the Alt key, click on the stopwatch to apply our expression, and we're going to use a wiggle property for this one. So I'm just going to type in the word wiggle, and then in parentheses, I'll put the value. So the first one I'm going to do is the wiggle amount. That's how many times per second the wiggle is going to be applied. I'm going to go fairly high, about 30, so it's pretty much once every frame. If you want to slow that down, you obviously can do so just by keying in a slightly less number. If I put in a comma, I can then put the actual amount by which I wish it to wiggle. So this is relating to its position and obviously is being registered in pixels. So I might choose to go up to 15 pixels in any direction on a randomly wiggled effect. So let's close off the parentheses there and just hit enter. And when I do that, we'll just notice a slight shift in the window. What I'll do is hit 0 to do a RAM preview. And you can see that the window is now moving around on screen, randomly being affected by our wiggle expression. Okay, so I'll just click and do a preview. You see the whole thing has now got this real wonderful shake to it, which looks just great. I might want to adjust that a shade more, and that's the wonderful thing about expressions. I can do that. So let's come back into here and just remove the 15, maybe replace it with 20. So we're now able to move up to 20 pixels in any direction. And as soon as we preview that, we have this great effect. Now, the final thing I would want to add to this is obviously motion blur. This is the whole reason for doing the camera shake effect. We wouldn't be able to see all of this in the wonderful clear focus that we have here, especially as it appears we're moving at a couple of thousand miles an hour inside of space. So what I'll do is come back down to the timeline. Let's turn on motion blur for this whole composition, and then turn on the motion blur preview right here, and again do another RAM preview. And now what we have is a much more realistic effect because all the layers in the nested composition are being affected by its position and its wiggle frequency to give us this wonderful camera shake effect. And there we can see the really nicely finished render. It looks so photorealistic. I mean, we started with just one layer of 3D animation, and we've created this totally seamless sky in the background from a Photoshop file and used the offset filter to make it more realistic. And like I said, the cool thing about the offset filter is because it's being created dynamically and the sky is being sped up in either direction, we can change that on the fly and make it slower or faster at any time. So you can build up a library of different sky graphics here and just pull them in as and when you need them, animate them out at different speeds, and you have a wonderful way to enhance your animation inside of After Effects. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. It's a really great example of the offset filter. Now what we're going to do is move on to the final one, which is going to be motion tile and grid. So let's close this composition down, come back to the project window here, and let's open the third one. So here we go, 03 motion tile and grid. Let's double click that. And if I just do a quick RAM preview through there, you'll see what we have is a logo that's set on one of our ArtBeats backgrounds, and I've used the Vegas filter to run some lights around the outside. Now what I want to do is to kind of compile together a couple of video effects to make a really nice spaced grid background to here where we've got multiple clips moving in different directions. Now normally to achieve that I would be using some masks, maybe some mattes, so maybe even some offset filters as well. We're actually going to do this with just 2 video clips and create multiple versions of them using a plugin called Motion Tile. So if we come down to the timeline, I'm going to start with the bottom layer here, which is the very bottom blue file. And I'm going to bring up my effects palette again, Command 5 or Control 5, and we're going to apply Motion Tile. So let me just type in MOT and that will bring it up. Double click it to apply it to our layer. Again, Command Control 5 to remove that. And we'll see here the various options that we have. So the first thing I should choose is really the tile width or the tile height, because these are the amount of tiles that I'm going to have. So if I take the tile width here and drag it, you'll see that the movie clip in the background is basically being shrunk, but it's also having an offset applied, kind of like the filter we saw a second ago, but it's actually applying a multiple offset that we can keep on coming down, and you'll see the same clip. So if I just leave it like that and do a quick RAM preview, you'll see the movie still moving in the background, but it's being replicated many, many times. And that in itself has immediately produced one really nice background. So I'm going to take the tile width back out to about a third of the way because I only want 3 of these, okay? And if we use an odd number, what will happen is 2 of them will move in one direction and another one will move in the opposite direction. Obviously, you can decide whether you want even or odd numbers. So if I do want a third, this is all done on a percentage basically of the screen size or on the clip size. So 33.3% basically will give me an exact third of that. And if I just do a RAM preview, we can see all 3 clips playing there. Now the way that they actually offset is with something called the phase. There's our preview. Now if we bring the effect controls back here, we have the phase right down here, and as soon as I click and drag that around, you'll see the 2 outer clips are being animated separately to the inner one. Alright, now 180 degrees will obviously play half of them, And if I come round to the very top there and select it to 1, we now could animate that property. So this is how we actually move those clips as if we're moving multiple elements that have been squashed and stretched and maybe even had masks applied. So let's go and add a keyframe for that. Let's come back to the very beginning. Let's turn on a phase keyframe, and then I'm going to scroll through the timeline all the way to the end, which is 10 seconds along, and then just take my phase value here and decide how many times I want that to play. So we could just keep on going round and round and round until I've reached a specific value. Let's maybe try 5 and just say OK. So we're now just going to do a quick round preview of that, and we can see the effect happening. So the central clip is staying the same, and the outer ones, the actual tiled versions, are being replicated up and down the page. So let me just preview that. So it's a pretty interesting way to deal with the video, and it's given us a really nice starting background. What we will do is add another clip over this in just a second and use a different type of tile. But that's pretty much set to what I want it to be. I actually want it to be even faster than that. We have a value of 5 at the moment at the end. Let's maybe go up to about 30. Let's try an even faster version because I want it to look a little bit crazy. So obviously this is kind of a whole wild Vegas theme we're looking at here. So I want everything very fast moving and dynamic in the background. So let's just do a quick round preview of that. It's pretty fast. I'm quite happy with that. What I might do is push this up even further because there's one more thing I want to show you. And it's one of my favorite things about this filter. So I've set that to 40 at the end. It's moving exceptionally fast. The really cool thing about motion tile is if I do a preview here, it almost looks like there's something wrong with the video signal and we've got everything moving up and down the screen as if we've lost our signal. Well, because we're applying motion tile and we effectively have motion keyframes here, motion tile works with After Effects' motion blur inside the timeline. It's really, really cool. Come down to the timeline here, turn on motion blur for this layer, and then turn it on in the main composition here, and let's do a round preview. And you'll see now the layers are being blurred according to the speed at which they're moving. So the edges across the bottom here where each clip reproduces itself, you see are now slightly feathered out because they're moving at a higher speed. Now if we want to, we could either increase the speed of these effects to make the blur even more excessive, or what we can do is obviously change the amount of shutter angle. Okay, so I'm just going to click and stop that. If I press Command K or Control K on the PC to bring up my composition settings for this composition only, and go to the Advanced tab here, I have the ability to basically increase the amount of shutter angle or the time that the shutter angle is left open for to give me more extensive motion blur. Now the default is set to 180. I can go all the way up to 720 if I wish to. And this means that items that move slower on the page can have more motion blur applied to them. You don't have to make them move really fast in order to apply the blur. Well, I'm going to go somewhere in the middle, around about 360. Say OK, and then do another quick round preview. And now you'll see that blur is much more apparent in the background, and it really does look like we've got two very fast moving items here, very similar to kind of a one-armed bandit. Again, it adds to that feel of Las Vegas. We've got the moving graphics here, but one static one in the center, so you can do some wonderful things with this, but see that difference? It's much nicer. Okay, now that's done that one. I'll go ahead and close the effect controls down, and back down here in the timeline, I have a second clip, which is currently hidden. Just go across and turn on its video preview. There we go, that's now sitting in the background of our file. And again, just do a quick round preview of that so we can see what is happening in the background. I like the way that the gold with this one will work with the blue background, so that's why I've chosen it. So with this layer highlighted now, I'm going to hit again Command 5 or Control 5 to bring up the effects palette. Motion tile is still selected, so let's double click it and that will apply it to this layer. And let's close that down, Command 5 again. And we can now specify different settings. So instead of doing a tile width this time, I'm going to tile the height. You see that we can stretch it down so we get more copies on a vertical scale. So again, the height is still dependent on the height of the clip itself in the composition. So a 20% one here is giving us 5 versions, and they will obviously offset in different directions. If I go down here to phase and drag this around, we won't actually see anything because the phase itself is set to do a vertical by default. So that's why we have a horizontal phase shift underneath here. And now when I drag around on phase, you see that these clips are moving horizontally. So this will give us the offset that we need. So let me reset that round to the top. What I'm going to do is adjust the tile height again to the same property value I had before, which was 33.3. So we get just 3. We're going to have 2 moving outside of the central graphic that we have. And you can also affect what's called the output width. So I can clip back here and actually bring in the values that I don't want to see. So I could almost set this to about here. Again, 33 or 33.3. And we would only see a third of this video clip and see the one that's going on behind. So a quick preview of that. we'll still see the motion blur and we have our repeating tiles here. So it's just to give you an idea of that kind of effect. What I'm going to do is come back and reset that. I want to bring the output width out a little bit more. I'm going to double that. I want to go 2/3. So let's keep ourselves accurate here. We can go 66, or if we want to be really smart, let's go for 66.6. Make sure everything matches perfectly. Now again, I want to animate the phase of this over the course of the animation. So let's come all the way back to the start of the timeline. Let's turn on the phase keyframe here. Again, ensuring that horizontal phase shift is turned on. And let me go all the way out to the end at 10 seconds. And again, let's just decide how many rotations we wish to do here. So we have 2, we have 3, do as many as we want to. So let's go for about 8. That will probably do. Another quick round preview just to double check that. And we can see those two layers moving. Now likewise, we can turn on motion blur for those as well, just to check that everything's moving as fast as it can. This whole thing is very fast paced. I don't want things moving too slowly in the background. And again, for my purposes, that's moving just a shade too slowly. So I'm going to bump up the 8 to about 50. Let's make that really, really fly. And again, like we did with the previous layer, let's turn on motion blur for this one. Do a round preview. And now we have the colors moving really nicely. We've got this wonderful pattern in the background that's being blurred out. And we've also got these 3 sections in the center, one of which is playing in real time, but the other 2 are being animated off the side with motion blur as well. So you can see that is a really, really fast-paced movie. What we're going to do is just tidy it up a little bit more. And we're going to use a grid for that. I actually want some lines to kind of define certain parts of this area, almost to look like these images are multiple video screens that are playing at the same time. Imagine a video wall. So I want to draw a grid over the top of this. So let me just click to turn off the preview there. I'll just close down my effect controls palette for a second. And what we're going to do to add the grid is I'm going to create a brand new solid to lay it down. So ensuring I'm all the way back down to the beginning of the timeline again. Let's press Command Y or Control Y to add a new solid, making sure it's the size of my composition, and we may as well go ahead and name this one grid so we know what it is, and I will say OK. Now automatically that's added to the top of my composition. I will turn on anti-aliasing at this point, and just for a second I'm going to go to its transparency values, which is hitting T on the keyboard, and drag the opacity down. I just want to see through it for a second. Now if I was to create a very structured layout at this point for this effect and I want to bring in lines and grids, I would normally use all the options that After Effects will give me, which are various grids that I have a choice of. And I'm just quickly going to show you those because they're very important. You might want to use them for specific layouts. Now if you take a quick look under the View menu up here on the right hand side, we do have our guides options. They're all grayed out in a second. Just make sure you have your composition selected here. If I come back and now go to View, you see we have the option to show rulers, which will appear around the outside of our comp window, exactly the same as you would see in Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, packages like that. And from there, if we click in either of the rulers, we can obviously drag out a guide onto the page to a specific pixel location, and wherever we drop that, that will then remain. Now you can pick it up and drag it to different points, which is easy enough to do, or if you want to lock them, just simply go back to the View menu here, and go down and say Lock Guides. And once that's done, I can't now roll over that guide and pick it up. See, my cursor has changed. So I'm just going to go back and say Unlock Guides, or I could even say straight to Clear Guides, so that immediately removes any that are there, and I'll hit Command R or Control R just to remove the rulers. Now the grids are one I want to look at as well. If I was drawing lines maybe in Illustrator and I'm going to bring them in so I can animate them on screen, so very straight lines that I probably wouldn't anti-alias so I don't get any soft edges to them, it would be handy if I had a grid layout so I could see exactly where they need to go on screen. Well, there's 2 types of grid that After Effects presents us with. If I come up to the View menu here, I do have an option that just says Show Grid, and we can't see another option there. This is the first one. Let me turn that on. You can see it. Now, this is one that's divided into a specific number of sections, which is basically a pixel dimension. This, I think, is about 80 pixels, and then it's broken down into a number of subsections. Now, these options are set inside of your preferences. If I quickly go to my After Effects menu and down to Preferences, and obviously depending on the operating system you're using, your preferences will be under the Edit menu if you're on OS 9 or on Windows, but up here in OS 10 it's underneath After Effects. And I'll go straight down to the option that says Grids and Guides. Select that, and you can see here that these are all the preferences for what we're seeing at the moment. So we see the color is green, and that's showing up there in the background of the window. But here we have the option for the actual sizes. It says there is a grid line being drawn every 80 pixels, and it's being subdivided into 4, which is obviously 20 pixels at a time. We also have the guides color here, so we can choose that so we can see it on the background. Obviously, your animations will contain different color backgrounds, so you might need to change that so you can view the guides each time. But obviously the grid line options here are quite important because this is preset no matter what size your composition is. Okay, so it doesn't automatically divide your composition down into an even number of sections. This is done to a preset value, so it's up to you if you want to set that. However, there's this option here called proportional grid. Now that is set to a horizontal value of 8 and a vertical of 6, and I'm going to show you exactly how we activate that. I'm going to leave that for a second. I'll just go ahead and click OK. Now instead of going back up to the view menu here to show and hide the grid, you can also do it right here on the Safe Areas button. If I hold down the Shift key and click on it, it will turn that grid off. Okay, so turning it click on and off just by doing the Shift key. However, if you hold down the Alt key or the Option key, it turns on the proportional grid, and that's the one that I just showed you in the preferences. So what this one does is, disregarding the size of the composition, it will evenly break it down into a specific number of horizontal and vertical areas so you can position elements easily. If I quickly bring up the preferences window again, and I'll just go through to grids and guides, and I specify the horizontal to be 6 and maybe the vertical to be 4, and say OK, it will automatically adjust it. And you see exactly what I've got here is the layout I will be looking for when we finish our presentation. I want a grid that matches this. And then if I wanted to now, I could go through, drop maybe 15, 20 lines from Illustrator on the page and position them using the grid. Obviously, I'm not going to do that. We're going to use a filter for it, but I did want to show you that all those functions are there. Let's go ahead and option click again on the Safe Areas button right here so we lose the grid. And then we'll come back down to the timeline, select my grid solid layer that we just created, and I'll push the opacity all the way back up to 100% again. And now we'll add our grid effect to it. So Command 5, let's pull up the effect controls palette again. And this one is very simply going to be grid. So let's double click to add it. And there we go, and close the effects window down. And now we can look at some of the controls for this particular filter. You can see it does have a lot of options in here, so we'll just go through a few of them. To start with, we have two differences. We have the anchor point and we have the corner point. And we can see these two here on screen right now. If I select the anchor point and pull it around, this is the central point of the grid. This is where it's actually created from. So if you want to leave that in the center, any changes you make to the shape and size of the grid will apply centrally on that point. So that's quite a good place to anchor it. Or if you want, simply have it move around screen so you can be a little bit more random. Just hit Command Z or Control Z to undo that. Likewise, we have the corner point down here, which can also be animated separately, which will affect the scale. So if you move the two around, there'll be no sort of definitive snap down point where this grid is going to start and finish. So you have full control over each of these options. So I'll set it round about there. If I come back to the effect controls window, you can see we also have the ability to say we're going to take the grid size from a width slider. Now this is really handy because it gives us an overall scale of a perfectly square grid that we can drag up or down and get the specific number of cells that we require. So you can drag up or down as much as you want to. And the cool thing about the grid effect is if you apply it to a layer that already contains content rather than a solid that we have now, it can actually affect the content as a mask. So you would be able to see through where the lines of the grid are, you would actually see through the content. So you can use it for a really cool mask effect because obviously you could animate the width and the height and everything and show and reveal the content as you go along. Also, you could say invert the grid, in which will give you an exact opposite. So you see the white content here and transparency through the lines of the grid itself. So these are also things to bear in mind. Bring down the size here and you get some really cool effects. So a lot of features here that we can actually play with. Let me bring the invert option back. If we also go back to grid size, we can say use width and height sliders, and this allows us to specify a different cell construction based on width properties and height properties. So I could start all the way out here, so there's only one central line, come all the way back and just end up on the side there. So we're going to use this to set up the grid that we want to see. So I'm going to set the width to about 60%. Okay, and I can always click on it and just key that value in. And the height I'm going to set to round about probably 40 or 41 just to sneak that off the top of the screen. Let's go 41. That'll do just fine. And then the border can obviously be animated in terms of thickness. So the thicker we get that, the less we can see through the mask. And obviously the thinner we go, the more fine it becomes. So again, more animatable properties that you can have some good fun with. I'm going to set it to about 3 pixels there. Scroll down a bit more. The next option we have is the feather of the lines themselves. Now, if I drop this down, this is really cool because we have a feather slider for the width and one for the height. So it's not applying an overall blur. So let me just increase the thickness again so you can see the effect. The border's thicker. Let's go to the width feather and drag, and you'll see that we're able to soften just the vertical lines here in the grid, which is really cool. Again, just undo that. come to the height option, and likewise we can do it this way. So you can almost fade them completely out of view and then animate that fade coming back in as and when you need to. Now obviously if you wanted to affect these two together, we could use an expression to tie them together, or we could even add another effect to this window, say a Gaussian blur or a directional blur, just to add something else in the pipeline and blur them out evenly. So there's different ways you can approach the feathering option. So let me close that back up. I'm just going to go back and reset the line thickness down to 3. And then towards the bottom here again, we still have the options to affect color and also the opacity. So this will fade back the lines of the grid so we see through it completely and then all the way back. And again, this is pretty handy when you're using invert grid because you can fade the color in and out. It's not quite so noticeable when you have just the stroke there. Now obviously we have transfer mode, so like we did with our 4-color gradient earlier, we can affect how this interacts with the pixels beneath it. I'm using a straightforward white line, so I'm actually going to leave that set to none. Now the grid is set exactly as I want it to be. I'm not adding any keyframes to this. So I can close this window down. I'm pretty happy with how that looks. And if I do a very quick RAM preview at this point, we can see that we have this really fast-paced effect of all these little video screens moving behind the background grid. Obviously, what we might want to do is to move this logo layer above the grid. If I just stop the RAM preview, my grid layer is still selected. I'm just going to hold down the Command key or the Control key on the PC and hit the left square bracket, and that will move this layer down one layer. Same command as when you're in Photoshop and in Illustrator. It's basically bring forward or send backward one layer at a time. Use that in conjunction with the Shift key and you will send all the way to the back and all the way to the front. So again, quick round preview, you see the grid is now rendered behind the background here. We've got these moving screen effects which are really cool. Obviously, using the motion tile is what's brought this animation together. We effectively have the wonderful view of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 video clips in here, plus a logo on top, that are all being animated with motion blur in different directions. The reality is we've only used 2 video clips and they're being replicated within themselves using the motion tile effect. Now, depending on if you're doing a layout like this where you're applying a grid over the top, we could obviously go into the motion tile properties and scale them so that you have the same video clip playing inside every single one of these squares. And it's just such a cool way to create really fast-paced graphics. And you can see how cool that looks now that it's all finished and done. Now, one thing I want to approach with you is the option for a looping animation. Let's say this is going to be supplied to our client and it's maybe going to be displayed in the airport or somewhere in a hotel or maybe at a trade show somewhere. We want to supply the smallest amount of video footage but set it to have a perfectly seamless loop. There is a small technique that's very important in achieving that. So I'm going to show you exactly how that's done. So what I'm going to do is show you a rotation of this logo that we have here in the center, just so you can see the problems that you can encounter and how very easy it is to overcome that issue. So if I come down here to the timeline, I'm just going to hit the solo icon for this layer so it's just visible on its own on the black background of the composition. And then I'm going to select the layer and just hit the R key to access the rotation properties, because this is going to be one of those property changes that we will definitely notice any problems with the smoothness of repetition. So I'm going to turn on a keyframe at 0 seconds, so we have our initial point, and I'm going to come out on the timeline to just 1 second across and apply one single rotation to that. Okay, so there's our second keyframe. What I'll also do at this point is hit the N key, and that will change my work area here, so I'm only going to preview when I do RAM preview between 0 and 1 second exactly. So if I do a RAM preview now, what we'll notice is the logo spinning around, reaches its bottom point. You can see exactly what's happening here. When we get round to the full 360 degree of evolution and the clip starts to loop again, we have this pause. Okay, you can see it just happening right at the very bottom there. The reason that's happening is the 2 keyframes that we've applied are effectively identical. The first one is no revolutions at 0 degrees. The second one is 1 revolution, but also at 0 degrees. It's actually coming around full circle. And because we're rendering a full second, we are seeing both of these keyframes in the render. And because we're seeing them both, we're actually getting a slight pause because the 2 of them are identical. So this will happen whenever you have a rotating value like this. And an easy way to overcome it is simply to take this final keyframe that we have right here, and I'm just going to move it along 1 frame. Now the shortcut for doing that is to hold down the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and hit the right arrow on the keyboard. That will move it 1 frame to the right. Obviously using the left arrow will move it to the left. So what that's done is it's now offset that value, so the last frame that we see is this one right here, which is where it's just about to return back to normal. And then the loop will send us right back to the very first frame, which is exactly where we would expect to be. So now a RAM preview of this will show us a perfectly seamless loop because we've just shifted that 1 keyframe off the side and now there is no step or pause in that particular process. So a very simple technique, but very, very effective, and one you should definitely bear in mind when you're faced with this issue. Now what I'll do is I'm going to leave that exactly as it is, and I'm going to come back to the very start of the animation and turn off the solo for this layer so we can see everything else underneath. And I'm going to change my work area so it comes all the way back out to 10 seconds. And then what I'll probably do is take this keyframe that we've got, because I want the rotation of this logo to continue throughout the whole animation. So I'm going to take the second keyframe and move it all the way to the end. If I hold down the shift key, it'll just snap onto the end point there. But obviously we're going to have to move that one frame across, otherwise we'll still have that same issue. Regardless of whether it's 1 second or 10 seconds, the looping technique is still the same. What I will do though is select each of the layers below. So I'm just going to shift click each of these ones and hit the U key to access any of their keyframe values, because each one of them had their motion tile option set to loop across a constant time of 10 seconds. And what I'm going to do is just select each of those frames. So we have only 3 keyframes here that we need to do. And again, I'm going to hold down the Option key or the Alt key and hit the right arrow just to move that across one frame. That will now smooth out the offset so we have a perfectly seamless loop. Now the animation of the logo is still set to just 1 revolution, which is now over 10 seconds. So I'm just going to double click this keyframe to bring up its properties. And I'm actually going to say revolve, let's go for 6 times, something like that. So we're just increasing the speed of that animation, but we still have the perfectly seamless loop because all these keyframes have been pushed just 1 frame beyond the end of the animation. And if we do one final round preview, we can see the effect all complete. So we have our rotating logo, which has got its perfectly seamless 360-degree loop, and we have our 2 video clips in the background with the motion tile applied with that really cool motion blur. Don't forget that. That's actually being rendered according to the speed of the motion tile settings that you apply. It's a very cool thing to point out. And everything is held together using our grid effect at the same time. So a few little simple filters here that pull together produce some really cool effects.